Joel, I think for Christians, the most bewildering book in all of the Bible is probably Leviticus.
Yeah. I think for most people, it's probably the most bewildering.
What's that for? Why did anybody make a collection of laws like that and think, then that this is something that should be put in the Bible and in the Torah?
So I think that the hardest leap for so many of us to make is to put ourselves back into a mindset of a world where the religious center is not just a structure, right? Not just the temple itself, but an actual sacrificial rite that is happening. I mean, the actual killing of animals and the sort of manipulating of that animal's blood, and that was universally in ancient Israel understood to be like the most significant sort of act of interaction with the deity. That was the equivalent of prayer for us today, or a church service or a synagogue service. This was how it happened, and everything about that is incredibly distant from us, I think.
So let's go with that for a minute then. Why did anybody think that the way to please God or communicate with God was to kill an animal? And maybe, on occasion, in the early days, kill something else besides an animal.
Yeah. So one thing we know is that this seems to be sort of cross-cultural.
Yeah.
It's not unique to ancient Israel. It's not unique to the ancient Near East. There is probably something at some very far distant past. I think they're feeding their gods, right? I think that it's not just the offering of an animal. I think there's actual there's food going on here. Right? There's an older idea back in the ether somewhere that shines through here and there. If you think about sort of the furniture inside the sanctuary in even the Israelite temple, there's a table, there's lamp, they lay out bread, there's wine. So there is certainly meal ideas going on here.
In the Babylonian flood story, the gods get hungry. At the end of it, when they have a sacrifice afterwards, the gods gather around it like flies.
Sure, I mean, it's all over the Hebrew Bible, or at least all over, Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus. Israel's God loves the smell of the sacrifices. The smoke, the scent of the smoke is pleasing. There's something There's something in the mists back there about feeding the deity, I think.
Yeah. Now, but you do also have the phenomenon of human sacrifice, even though this isn't highlighted in the book of Leviticus. Mm-hmm. But we do have the story of Abraham and Isaac, the near miss. We have Jephthah's daughter. There probably was some occurrence of it in the ancient world. Now, were the gods cannibals that way?
Right. So
admittedly, they're not eating gods.
Right. It might not all be this. It might not all be the same thing.
Yeah.
There's certainly an aspect in those cases, I think, of the way that we use the term sacrifice, which is the giving up of something that is valuable to you, as a demonstration of loyalty or of devotion. But there's still a gift aspect to it. Yeah. Right? There's the transferring of something from our world to the divine world,
which is the spirit world, and the way there is a delivery problem.
Sure,
they didn't have Amazon,
right.
Even FedEx. So how do you transfer your gift to the god? And one way of doing it is, convert it into smoke,
right, and let it
go up and drift up. And I think they thought of that quite literally.
Yeah, maybe.
Now, what are the kinds of things that they use sacrifice for? When would you have to sacrifice?
So there's essentially, there's two big categories of sacrifice. There's the kind of sacrifice that I think we often, it's certainly more common and we think of more readily, which is you want to say thanks, or you want to ask for something. You want to show your devotion or show your loyalty, And so these are the kinds of offerings that you offer voluntarily. What we might call free will offerings or Thanksgiving offerings. Jephthah's daughter is a good example. If I am successful, I will sacrifice this, right, to say thank you. Or I, am hoping for good results from my crop, and so I will offer a sacrifice in hopes that. These are sacrifices that sometimes you burn the entire animal, the whole burnt offering, the olah, and the entire animal goes onto the altar and is turned into smoke. Sometimes they're the kinds of offerings where you burn some of the animal, the priests eat some of the animal, you get some of the animal back and sort of have a party. Sort of festival, celebratory occasions are mostly like that. And those are the two kinds of sacrifices that we see really all over the Bible.
Now, for much of the history of early Israel, was this the only occasion when you could eat meat?
It wasn't the only occasion when you could, but it was probably one of the rare times when you did. Meat was expensive, very expensive. These are early Israelites, mostly poor farmers, for whom, and meat is difficult to raise in that part of the world on the hillsides. So I think. Again, to offer an animal, this is something of great value. So to say I'm going to sacrifice a sheep, and you think I just said it now. I think of the parable and the David and Nathan's parable of the man with the poor man with his one sheep. A sacrifice could be an enormous expense, and so the idea that you'd be eating some of the meat of that animal to sort of partake in it.
So, how much of the food of it actually went to the priests? Now, I'm thinking of a late story of Balaam the dragon, one of the additions to the book of Daniel. And, this is part of where it's a satire about Babylonian religion where they leave out offerings that the god is supposed to eat, and then the priests come and take them.
Sure.
But there are also stories in the Bible. There's one in 1 Samuel of the priest going in and grabbing the good bits of meat out of the pot. Could it be abusive?
Sure. I think that in Leviticus, at least, there's no sense of that. I mean, they lay out the rules for what it's supposed to be. The priest is supposed to get the breast and the thigh of the animal. That's it. God gets.
Which isn't bad.
It's not bad.
Yeah.
God gets the inside bits, mostly the fat, which.
Good thing he has peculiar taste.
Well, I also enjoy the fat, maybe not in such quantities, but it certainly smells good, and it burns well. In terms of our conversation about it turning into smoke, but then the offerer gets a good substantial bit of the animal back. So you've got this category of voluntary sacrifices for Thanksgiving and for that, and then there's it takes up more of the text, at least of Leviticus, a whole other set of offerings of sacrifices that are not voluntary, that you have to offer when you have sinned or if you have become impure, and we should stop there because those are categories that are not at all transparent to modern readers. The questions of impurity and purity, and their partner parallel to that, which is sacred or holy and profane.
Yeah. What does it mean to be holy? I would occasionally throw out that question in class and found that by and large, students didn't have a clue.
Yeah,
that
it's such a vague term.
And it's not something that people aspire to anymore. Now, when we get to the Holiness Code, we'd be told, be ye holy as the Lord is holy.
Yeah.
And this isn't on anymore.
and nor do I think that it's on in the first half of Leviticus, which is what we're talking about, I think mostly here, which is, so one of the things that we can point out is that the word holy, kadosh, comes, comes from essentially the word, its base meaning means to be separate. Yeah. And in a sense, that's what defines holiness, at least for these priestly writers who are responsible for Leviticus. What defines holiness is the separateness of belonging to God. There's all sorts of things that are holy. Right? God is obviously holy. The priests are holy. Time is holy, right? The time that God has set aside, the Sabbath and the festivals. Space is holy, the temple. And when you sacrifice an animal, the moment you lay your hands on it and say, I am making this as a sacrifice, now it's holy too. The menorah and the furniture and the stuff you use, the altar, all that stuff is holy. It all belongs to the sacred sphere. And it's always holy unless something comes along to profane it. And you and I are profane and can basically never become holy. Right? The only people who can be holy are priests, and that's because they're anointed with the oil that makes them so.
Actually, my favorite illustration of this comes from the book of Ezekiel. In chapter 44, they're laying out the different categories. It's mainly a matter of making distinctions.
Yeah.
So that when you go on the altar, you wear linen vestments, but you got to take them off afterwards. Otherwise, you might communicate holiness to the people.
Yeah.
And you would think that might be a good thing to do, but no, because if you do, you're eliding the difference.
Yeah, and you're in a sense almost you're preventing, right? Things that are holy have much stricter rules around them. You think about laws like we have in Leviticus about the high priest, who is very, very extra holy, who is not allowed, it seems, maybe even to leave the temple compound because it could come into contact with things that are not holy or with things that are impure. And really, the nexus that must be avoided is holiness and impurity. And impurity is the troubling, is the thing that problematizes holiness. Yeah,
we'll probably skip over it for sake of time, but there is this nice story of Nadab and Abihu, where it's not so much the danger of impurity as a question of power, of authority, who is allowed to offer sacrifice.
And in what circumstances? Again, it's all about the rules, right? And I think that story, the story of Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus 10, is very much about God has just given in the previous chapters all of these very clear rules about how you're supposed to do it, and they come along and do a tiny little thing a tiny bit wrong, and poof, right, they're destroyed for it. That's to say something about just how strict holiness, I think, can be.
Now, what about purity and impurity?
Yeah. So it's really easy for modern readers to hear impurity, and think sickness or dirt or or bad, right? To have some sort of moral valence to it. But that's not at all what's happening, right? Impurity.
Although you will find some scholars to this day who try to argue that, and there's a long tradition of it, who say that this was health care. Baloney, I think. But
I think so too. Certainly, by the time we're here, but certainly what it doesn't have is any moral or ethical value to it whatsoever. Purity and impurity, first of all, are categories that just exist naturally in the world. And you can become impure through all kinds of perfectly normal, in fact, required things like sex and childbirth and burying your dead. All those things make you impure. There's no universe in which any culture is saying you shouldn't do those things. Maybe Paul. But so it's not that they're bad. It's just that they cause impurity. Impurity is like, well, it's a state, but it's also like it's kind of like a film, like a miasma that is transferable, right? So if something is very impure and you touch it, you can become a little impure. The main thing about impurity that people, I think, most often misunderstand is it's totally okay to be impure. There is nothing wrong with it. People were impure most of the time. Here's what you can't do while you're impure. You can't go near the holy.
Yeah.
So you can't go offer sacrifices. You can't attend festivals, right? There's a story about David who can't attend a festival because he's impure, or at least so Jonathan says. So you could otherwise go about your life for the most part. Impurity, like sin, though sort of contaminates the sanctuary, right? For reasons that are not so clear to us. The sacred space attracts impurity, invisible impurity and sin, and you're responsible for cleaning it. That's your job.
And if you're not going into the sacred space, you don't have to worry about it.
Well, you certainly don't have to worry about cleaning yourself, but you do have to offer, well, again, it's so complicated. Right? If it's a minor impurity, something totally easy, the only thing you have to do is take a bath. You take a bath and you sleep it off, and you're pure again the next day, for a few hours probably. A major impurity requires an offering, because your impurity has created contamination and dirt in the sacred space. And that's what all of these involuntary sacrifices are about. They're all about cleaning up the mess that your sin or your impurity has created inside the tabernacle, in God's home. Because God literally, physically lives there in this text. It's God's space. You've made it dirty. It's like when my kid knocks over a glass. I'm not mad at you for knocking it over, but you do have to clean it up, right? And if you don't clean it up, now I'm mad at you, right? And these sins and impurities accumulate and accumulate, and people clean them up as best they can, but sometimes they forget, or they don't even know it happened, and the house gets messy. And when the house gets too messy, you got to do a spring cleaning, or in this case, a fall cleaning, which is the festival that we call Yom Kippur, which is described in Leviticus 16.
We'd better hold on that, though, I think.
Sure.